Okay guys, we need to talk a little bit about muscles. I want to keep it as simple as possible because a lot of people have the tendency to make this too confusing. So we've mentioned this a little bit. Our muscle can either shorten, lengthen, or contract in both manners at the same time. So we have that either concentric, eccentric, or else isometric contraction, where both are contracted equally, neither one is moving, neither lengthening nor shortening. The time it takes to switch from either shortening to lengthening or lengthening to shortening is what's often called the period of amortization. It's that switching period. And one of the easiest ways to make that switch very, very rapid and very, very powerful is through the use of what's called the stretch-shortening cycle, which is this idea that anytime a muscle is stretched near its capacity, inside it, the spindles, the sensors in the muscles feel and they fear that the muscle is going to be overextended, strained and torn. And so the muscle reflexively, and that's the important thing, it reflexively and instinctively contracts to protect itself. So in that instance, you have a moment of contrary contraction pulling the muscle back. So I think of a punch, or I think of my arm. If I swing my arm back to its maximum, at its maximum, the natural reflex of the body is to pull it back in order to protect it, which means I have a tiny little threshold there. It's about 100 milliseconds. And in that 100 milliseconds, all of my muscle is firing reflexively, instinctively to take it back. If I bounce my arm back and take it back, then I can maximize that so-called stored elasticity in the connective tissue and all of that sort of reflexive contraction to pull the arm back. The most common example you'll see is in a jump. So if we talk about plyometrics, we're talking exactly about using that explosiveness. If I was to use, for example, this marker on the wall here, this little panel, if I simply squat down to my maximum and from that position jump up to my max, I will have a certain amount of strength and a certain amount of power. But if instead, when I go down, I add a tiny little bounce at the bottom, that extra bit of elasticity and that reflex of my body to protect itself from overstraining and overstretching will help launch me up. This is super important to understand because even at a primal level, at a reflexive level, when people get extremely tired, they will bounce. I'm going to give you a really basic exercise that I would like you to try at home. So for this exercise, all you need to do is full, long push-ups until you're at failure. And what you'll notice is that when you're getting to the point where the muscles are lactic and you're struggling to get those last reps, if you get to the bottom, I want to get right to failure where it's difficult for me to get to elongation. If at that point you had a bounce at the bottom, that little bounce is going to trigger the stretch shortening cycle. And the stretch shortening cycle is going to help your muscles again in that 100 millisecond window reflexively fire in the opposite direction. That's the full power of reflex. That's your whole evolutionary capacity pulling you back up. And that'll give you extra push when there's nothing left in the tank. When we look at punching, we'll see that at a very primal level, people will open to get that stretch. Some people with a little bit more training, a little bit more skill, will then masterfully, intentionally bounce in one direction in order to rip back in the opposite. So we're going to take a look specifically at how to use this to our advantage in punching. Now, before we even get to the domain of tactical application, we have to get into the domain of practical application. We need to make sure in practice doing the technique we're doing it safely. As soon as we begin to use the stretch shortening cycle, we are bringing our body, bringing certain aspects, limbs, joints to the perimeter, to the verge of their capacity. So it's extremely important we learn to do this very safely. If we take the example of just standing in a natural stance, and we look at this idea of having the arm and whipping it open to its that maximum threshold where it wants to bounce back. There are a lot of ways we can mess this up. Number one, we can have an unstable spine, and as we do this, we could overflex the lumbar and have this excessive arch, and that's going to hurt the back. So we want to make sure we begin, as always, stable, tailbone under, glutes are in, ribs are compressed, shoulders are comfortable. from that position, a very easy way to learn it is if I take a staff and I hold it equally and I just turn, the first area I will notice the strain is in my legs. Usually I'll start to feel a shearing across the meniscus. So ideally, when I'm doing this, and we've covered this at length in our ICSA certification series, level 2 in striking for the pivot, I want to see that my leg is lifting up. That pivot, in effect, is moving my center line with my knee. And so I'm maintaining a good alignment in the knee and the center line of my body. Whereas if I didn't turn my knee, I will be moving my center line away, and that's going to put stress into my knees. So I want to see that I'm pivoting very comfortably. When this becomes comfortable, what I'll do at my extreme is I'll see that there's a natural bounce at the end. We talk about this in our level 3 download on breathing, specifically in our treatment of reactive breathing. We get in depth into the role of the stretch shortening cycle movement with reactive breathing. But for now, it suffices to just let the breath come out. And from that motion, once that becomes comfortable and I feel safe in my legs and my trunk, I can add a little double bounce. And I really take that extra bounce just to give myself a little bit more time to feel it coming back. Once the double bounce becomes comfortable, then I can go back to a single and feel the speed and the effort of coming, the speed and the lesser effort that's required to come back. It's a very simple exercise to start feeling it in your torso. We want to make sure that we're neutral. We want to make sure that our legs are respectful. And what's nice about this is that it's teaching us to breathe in combination with our structure. If I'm having difficulty feeling it, I can go even beyond a double and go into multiples and then back to a single. And again, the multiples are not to give you more advantage, but rather to give you more time to feel it. And then once it feels familiar and you're seeing that you're not continuing to overextend your limit, but rather consistently repeating the same level of rotation, my wall, if you will, where it should end. Once I feel that wall, I only need to go there once. And this way my spine is safe and ready to work. Here's a great exercise that applies directly to this notion of spring-loading the hand and the arm through the torso. So what you need for this exercise ideally is a medicine ball. So what we want to do is we want to hold this nice and stably in the cradle of the arm. We're going to pivot away. Frame of the outside leg should be nice and stable. I'm going to have a little bounce here. Legs and elbow, throw it back. And at the beginning I can almost release just to tap it. Use the bounce off the wall to catch. I will usually exhale on the compression into the lung. You can do it both ways, whatever you prefer. And of course you can grow your distance slowly. Now when you are further away, remember you should try to throw a little higher as well.